Hello friends, and welcome to yet another episode of Economic Sutra. In this episode, I'm going to look at the uses and misuses of data. Now, I apologize if it sounds like a bit of an arcane topic, but bear with me and I'm sure you'll find it interesting because it's a very important issue. Now, as a policymaker, obviously, I look at data all the time. This is absolutely critical because data is the feedback that I get in order to know whether I am or I'm not making progress towards whatever is my objective. So it is very important that we get high quality data on time and that it is reflective of whatever it is that we are trying to measure. Unfortunately, there are serious problems with the use of data in India during policy making, and I'm going to highlight some of them. But let's go right to the beginning. Why do we need data at all? And let me illustrate to you that when you make policy without going and looking at hard data and base it on, say, anecdotes or whatever philosophical view you may have of the world, then you end up hardwiring into our policies errors that can then get perpetuated over decades. Just as an illustration, I'm going to take the issue of legal metrology. Now, what is legal metrology? Legal metrology, or specifically the Legal Metrology Act of 2009, pertains to weights, measures and labels. So it's something that all of you deal with all the time. When you buy a product, you'll see all the labeling. Well, that's all covered by the Legal Metrology Act. Now, India is very peculiar and having very severe criminal penalties for even minor infractions of the Legal Metrology Act. The result of this criminalization of even minor infractions is that it gets, not only does it get in the way of ease of doing business, because even small variations here or there lead to criminal prosecution, but of course it is a source of a large amount of rent seeking by legal metrology inspectors and others. It's a big topic that is debated all the time, and the Jan Vishwas bill, which is right now making its way through the Parliament, attempts to fix some of this. But why did we end up with this enormous amount of criminalization in the Act in the first place? Is it the case that we inherited it from the colonial period? It turns out no. The laws that we had even as recently as the 60s actually did not criminalize anything other than very extreme forms of deviations. What happened usually would be a fine commensurate to whatever infraction had been done. And this is basically what most other countries in the world do. But in the 1970s, we changed these laws such that small deviations or errors in weights, measures or labeling can lead to criminal prosecution. So why did we end up with this? It happened because there was something called the S.K. Maitra report on legal metrology in 1972. And that report, which was actually a committee which was headed by Joint Secretary S.K. Maitra, and in that report they argued that there needed to be exemplary punishments against any businessman who had done some infraction on weights, measures, labels and so on. Now, was this based on data? It turns out no. It was actually based purely on an anecdotal approach to policy making. So you have this rather strange story, which is the basis of the entire report and then the consequent laws, which relates to the use of a box by sweet sellers when they are weighing these sweets. In other words, what Mr. S.K. Maitra and his committee were saying, that when a sweet seller places the box on the weighing scale, they are effectively cheating the sweet buyer of the weight of the box. Now, this evidently was seen as a very major infraction, and in fact, as you can see, I'll quote from the report. It says, the customer thus loses sweets worth about 50 paisa to 90 paisa per kg, the price of the cardboard box being 30 paisa or so. The committee then arrived at an arbitrary estimate that the sweet shops around the country were making about 18,000 to 36,000 rupees a year from basically this adding the box to the weighing scale. Now this, by the way, was not based on any survey of any kind. No kind of investigation was done into whether these numbers were accurate or not. This just happened to be the opinion of the committee, and as a result of this, the committee came to the conclusion that not just sweet shops, but every kind of business in the country had to be placed under the threat of criminal prosecution under any infraction of the Legal Metrology Act. And these criminal provisions then made their way all the way even when the 2009 Metrology Act was put together. In these criminal provisions continued into them. It's only now that we are re-looking at them. But my purpose here is not to look at legal metrology. My purpose is merely to illustrate what happens when you do not use hard data that you went and gathered in order to come to some conclusion. What happens is that just based on some anecdote of a committee sitting in a room, you come up with a policy, you hardwire it into the system, and then literally lakhs of businesses in the country over decades have been prosecuted under criminal provisions that had been created as a result of this rather non-data based approach to policy making. So I hope I have shown you why data is very, very important. Now let me get into the issue of the quality of data. So of course data is important, but it is only meaningful if the quality of data is good. And again, I'm going to illustrate to you how when data itself is misleading, you can end up with very distorted outcomes. Now many of you may be aware of the issue of anemia in India. I'm sure you read in newspapers and so on that a very large proportion of India's women and also children suffer from anemia. And many government schemes, thousands of crores have been spent on trying to resolve this anemia problem in India. However, despite 2 decades of effort, this anemia problem simply doesn't seem to go away. So what is the issue? Because if you have identified a problem and then you have spent thousands of crores on it, one of 2 things must be true. Either that the original identification of the problem is wrong, or that whatever solution that you are attempting is not quite correct. Either which way, you need to relook at it and relook at the data. So we decided that we were going to relook at the data for anemia. Now the reason we have this impression that India has this severe anemia problem goes back actually to the late 90s, when an NFHS, that is the National Family and Health Survey, which is done every few years, and it's the most important health survey we do in the country, that found that a very high proportion of Indian children and Indian women suffered from anemia. So this particular study was then used to come up with a large number of interventions. As I said, 2 decades of interventions have been done. However, despite 2 decades of intervention, the incidence of anemia, however, has barely come down. So let me read to you some of the data that we have on this issue. So here is what we found, that according to the latest NFHS, which happened in the year 21 in fact, because of COVID it actually extended into 21, and we found that the prevalence for under 5 children has barely decreased from 70% in 1998-99 to 67% in 2019-21. In other words, 2 decades of intervention have only caused a minor 3 percentage point decline in the incidence of anemia. Even more strangely, we found that the rate for women in the age group 15 to 49 has increased from 52% in 98-99 to 57% in 19 to 21. In other words, after all this effort, what has happened is that anemia has actually worsened. Now, what is going on here? So we investigated this and we found something very interesting. about how data is gathered. So as I said, accuracy of data is everything. So is this data accurate? So we looked into it and we found something very, very interesting. First of all, it turns out that the way that we are benchmarking whether or not Indians are anemic or not is against a WHO or global benchmark for hemoglobin levels. Now, how was that hemoglobin level arrived? Well, it turns out that many decades ago, a survey of a relatively small survey had been done of a white adult population in North America and Europe in 1968. And that is the global benchmark against which all of us are being measured to see whether the hemoglobin levels are high or not. It turns out that this is a completely wrong way of thinking about it, because it is well established and there are a large number of studies, whether in India or even abroad, which show that different ethnic groups have different levels of normal hemoglobin. And Asians in particular actually have a lower level of normal hemoglobin levels. In other words, we are all trying to aspire for hemoglobin levels which are actually unhealthy and too high for us. Our hemoglobin levels should actually be much lower. So this is one major error, i.e. benchmarking ourselves against inappropriate global standards, that also very outdated ones. Well, that is not the only problem. We also found, and there again many studies published in places like the New York Academy of Sciences or Lancet, etc., they showed that if you measure the hemoglobin using a pinprick on your finger, i.e. the blood is taken by making a pinprick, or if it is taken intravenously through a syringe, then there are very large differences in outcomes. So if you do it through the pinprick, it turns out that the blood that gets taken from the pinprick, the hemoglobin levels in that are naturally significantly lower than, for example, if you did it intravenously. And here is a study that I have here by Neufeld, which was published in the Annals of New York Academy of Sciences, which you can see, which talks about measuring women in Uttar Pradesh, for example, and they found that when they did through the capillary method, which is the pinprick, the level of incidence of anemia turned out to be 59%. But when they did it through the intravenous method, i.e. taking it out through a needle into your from your veins, then that level actually fell to 35%. So simply changing the way in which the blood was collected meant that the anemia levels amongst women from Uttar Pradesh in that age group dropped very, very sharply, just because of this difference in capillary method and intravenous method. Now, what happens if you happen to combine the two, i.e. change the benchmark to something more sensible, and you also collect the blood correctly and use the gold standard for measuring? Now again, a study was done on this, published very, very recently by Harshpal Sachdeva et al. Here is the copy of the report. It was published in Lancet in 2021, and they did a very large survey and they discovered something quite interesting. So for example, I'll just give you a readout. There's a lot of data here, just so that you get a sense. For example, if you take women aged 15 to 19, for example, that age group, then the WHO's methods will get you to a anemia level of 47.5%. But if you made corrections using the gold standard, this drops to 14.9%. So drops from 47.5 to 14.9. And of course, even that 47.5, which WHO uses, is significantly lower than what NHFS was telling us, which is somewhere in the 50s. So what I'm trying to show you is that yes, data is important, but it has to be correct data. And when you use inappropriate global standards, when you use inappropriate ways of collecting the data, what you will end up is with a data signal to the policymaker, which is wrong. Now, I'm not here to make the case that anemia is not an issue. I mean, if it 14.9%, 15% is still a pretty high level. We need to do something about this, but it does clearly suggest that anemia levels in India are nowhere near what is being claimed by some of the earlier studies, and therefore the responses to them from a policy making perspective has to be very, very different. This was just an illustration of poor data causing biases in policy making. Now I'm going to show you what happens when we say that, okay, Indian data is being collected not so well, but I'm going to look at global data. Maybe the global organizations are better at collecting data. So I hope you were able to see how good data is absolutely critical. So not only is data important, but that the data is a good signal of what is actually going on. Because if you end up with biased signals, as you can see in the case of anemia that I just illustrated, you will end up with obviously the wrong conclusions. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that, oh, Indian data collection is the problem. If only we were collecting data from international organizations and so on. And even here, there are serious problems. A lot of the data collected worldwide by international organizations have serious biases in them. And this is particularly true for data related to India, where international organizations have ended up introducing all kinds of flaws into the conversation. I looked at this in a working paper published a couple of months ago. This is called Reversing the Gaze. It says re-examining estimates of India's development indicators by international organizations, where I looked at data from UNDP, by WHO and other organizations, and as I mentioned, we found a lot of biases in them. I'm going to illustrate the problem of these biases using the issue of life expectancy at birth as estimated by the WHO, and later on incorporated by the UN population statistics, which then caused a big drop in their estimate of life expectancy in India thanks to COVID, as they argued. And I'm going to show you that it does not stand up to scrutiny. So what happened is this. The life expectancy in India till COVID hit was estimated at about 70.9. So let me explain what this statistics actually means. It means that a child born in 2019 in India was expected to live to 70.9, around about 71 years of age. So the average child born there would be expected to live till 71 years of age. Now what happens is COVID comes and hits us, and there are cuts in life expectancy in many countries, but India is one of the countries where the biggest cuts are done. So you find that the estimate goes from 71 years to 67.2 years. So, more than a drop of, it's about 3.7 years was slashed off the expected life expectancy at birth for India. Now, why does this matter at all? Well, it matters because these kinds of data then find their way not only into the UN's own population projections, but they eventually also end up in all kinds of other things. For example, the Human Development Index, which is very widely used, and it suddenly India's Human Development Index indicators suddenly drop. Now, why is this a problem? Not only is there a conceptual problem, but there is also a problem with the data. What is the problem? Well, first of all, the WHO did not accept India's official numbers of COVID deaths. What it did is it created its own model and added to excess deaths in it. This was not based on any surveys. It was based purely on some newspaper reports and other media reports that they had read, which they fed into their model, and they came out with a very large number. In fact, their model puts the number of cumulative excess deaths in India from the COVID pandemic at being the highest in the world, much higher than Indonesia, US, and so on. India at that time, as some of you will remember, had objected to this, and I personally think that this is absolutely unacceptable. Nevertheless, the funny thing is, even if you accept the WHO's number, you cannot actually come up with the reduction in life expectancy that the WHO argues for. So let me prove this to you. So I mentioned the number of cumulative deaths were very high. Well, you have to adjust it for the population. I mean, obviously larger countries will have larger number of deaths. So once you adjust it for population, however, it turns out that the number of deaths in a country adjusted for a lack of population, that's the usual way it's done, turns out to be significantly lower. So in India, for example, there were 375 deaths per lakh that happened during this period. But this is much, much lower than, say, Brazil, where that number is 645, US, where the number is 607, in Italy, where it is 588. So India, the adjusted for population number is 375. India had the highest reduction in its life expectancy number. India's life expectancy was dropped from 70.9 to 67.2, which is a reduction of 3.67 years. Compare that, for example, for the US, which was only 1.94 years, or Germany, where it is just 0.9 years. All of these are countries, by the way, as you can see in the table on your screen, were all countries which had much higher death rates adjusted for population. So how did the WHO come up with this number? When we asked for explanations, we were not given any reasonable explanations, and I have, as I said, published this issue in a working paper published by the EAC to PM working paper series called Reversing the Gaze, Re-examining Estimates of India's Development Indicators by international organizations, published in March 2023. You can go yourself to the website and have a look at it and decide what you think. So friends, I hope you can see why data matters, that there are biases in a lot of the data that is collected, not just by Indian agencies, but also by global agencies. And in fact, in many cases, the global agencies seem to have gone out of their way to introduce certain discrepancies in the data. Now, obviously, data matters because they are the guide based on which we have to do policy making. They are the feedback loop, and they matter no matter which kind of economic policy, social policy you are doing. But there is a new kind of concern which I have relating to data, and it's used particularly to create regulations around environmental, social and governance standards. Now, some of you may have heard of ESG norms. This is the environmental, social and governance norms. These are norms that are now getting rolled out worldwide in all kinds of areas, and as I said, these are not to be taken lightly. They will begin to influence all your lives, whether you're a businessman or you're a government policymaker or even just a consumer. You are going to find that these are going to become important globally and also getting rolled out in India. But the question then is, what are these norms, who monitors them, and what is the data that goes into this? And I think it is very important that the average citizen understands this. So what is the source of this ESG issue? Now, the source of this is a 2006 UN paper which talked about the need for having environmental, social and governance norms. Now, be very clear, I have no problem with having some sort of basic norms in all of these areas, because they are clearly important areas, and some sort of a set of norms are needed for us to be able to govern the global commons. The problem is the original paper does not lay out how these norms should be, and there's no global understanding of which norms should be utilized. So what has happened is that a very small group of think tanks, almost all based in the North Atlantic, whether in North America or in Western Europe, they have taken it upon themselves to set some of these norms. Not only have they set up these norms, what they have then done is commissioned themselves to essentially monitor these norms and to then effectively, like with the case of sovereign ratings and other kinds of credit ratings, to kind of give out certificates to everybody on whether they are or are not complying with these ESG norms. Now, as I said, there is no problem with having these norms as such. The problem really is that there is no global discussion on this. A small group of Western think tanks and NGOs have basically begun to roll these out, and now they are getting hardwired into real world decision making. So how is it that these ESGs are getting rolled out so rapidly? Well, it turns out that the World Bank has taken upon itself to create a set of ESG variables, and you can see them on our website. Now, I want to be very, very clear that when we questioned the World Bank, their view was this is not actually endorsed by the World Bank, it is simply collated by the World Bank. But the problem is, by the very virtue of the fact that the World Bank is collating all of these, it ends up giving them legitimacy. Now, some of these are data that are hard data, like the ones we discussed earlier, but one of the complications that now happens is that there is a lot of soft data as well. These are actually opinion-based indicators, perception-based indices, a lot of them like the ones that we discussed in an earlier episode of Economic Sutra. And these are then put together by these think tanks. So let me give you examples of them. Economic and Social Rights Performance Score, Control of Corruption Estimate, Government Effectiveness Estimate, and so on. So many of these are opinions. There are other opinions, for example, relating to rule of law or voice and accountability. You will then find issues like democracy, freedom of academic freedom, press freedom, and all these kinds of fuzzy subjective indices beginning to enter, and in some ways these are using the hard data as piggybacking them and entering into the policy space. And what World Bank does is puts them in one place, as I said, takes no responsibility for them, but as I said, effectively provides legitimacy to them. I am very, very concerned that such norms are now going to enter every aspect of your life. In fact, in January 2023, the European Union has adopted many of these and mandated that every company has to have some compliance to these ESG norms. I have here, for example, another report which is by JP Morgan Asset Management, which, as you know, is one of the world's largest asset managers and banks. And here is a report by it published in November 2022 called Sovereigns and ESG, Taking a Stance on a Complicated World. Again, you will see if you turn the page there, and there is here an Exhibit 4 where it says JP Morgan Asset Management Sovereign ESG Scoring Framework, and it has a whole bunch of framework. Again, you will see most of these are taken from the World Bank, and then the World Bank itself takes them or collates them from other indices. So this collation of data, and of course a lot of it coming from perception based indices, means that ultimately what is happening is that these opinion of a bunch of think tanks is getting hardwired into real life decisions relating to trade deals, relating to investment, relating to consumer behavior, and so on and so forth. Now, I keep repeating this, I have no problems with the concept of having some basic ESG norms. My problem is that these norms have not been discussed more widely. It is not very clear who came up with these norms, why these are the norms and not some other norms that should be done. It is also not very clear why these think tanks who have just self-proclaimed themselves to be the purveyors of these norms, and who gave them the right to go ahead and pass judgment. There is no discussion on the data collection system. There is no collection on the methodology. No discussion on the methodology, and the net result of it is that we are getting tied up into what may appear to be very data-driven decision making, but in fact is a web of opinions and methodologies that I'm afraid, if not more transparently discussed worldwide, ends up becoming almost looking like a form of neo-colonialism by which a small clique basically decides how the world is run. So I have tried in this report and other reports that I have written, articles in the newspapers as well, to give a flavor to the general public about the uses and misuses of data. I hope you like this particular episode of Economic Sutra, where I gave you a view of the range of data issues that we have, and specifically the new emerging data problem that we will have with ESG unless we participate in first the discussion about how these ESG norms are arrived at, who monitors them, and who gives out certificates. With that, we come to the end of this episode of Economic Sutra. Hope you liked it. Look forward to see you at the next episode of Economic Sutra right here on Sansad TV.